Massive wildfires are burning across Northern California right now, destroying homes, prompting mandatory evacuations. The lightning complex fire has scorched more than 131,000 acres in 4 counties. Firefighters there working around the clock in triple-digit temperatures, just trying to get those flames under control. NBC News correspondent Jennifer Bjorklund reports from Vacaville.
Allison, so many fires they can't keep an accurate count as dozens of smaller fires are bunched into larger fires, which they're calling complex fires. Now, those fires they're working very hard to get a handle on, but as you can see, they lost the battle with many properties overnight. Testing fire crews to the limits, threatening thousands of homes, these fires are. The fire between San Francisco and the California state capital of Sacramento doubled in size since yesterday, and thousands are under evacuation orders. And we know that more evacuations are imminent. There were 11,000 lightning strikes over 3 days that started exactly 367 fires that they know about. And again, they bunch those fires together into what they call complex fires, just for the sake of keeping track of them all. And residents who've been taking refuge in their home during the coronavirus pandemic, forced to leave those homes behind. Many won't have anything to return to. Lives lost in these fires. We know of a utility lineman who is working with fire crews and also a firefighter pilot whose helicopter went down. Those are the casualties that we know of, and in the heat of battle, fire crews are also working to make some heroic rescues. We've heard of some burn injuries transported to hospitals. But again, these fires, all bad news over the next couple of days. We do know that there is one containment line of about 5% around one of these fires, but otherwise there is no relief in sight until the weather starts to cooperate.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.